Evening. I'm Mark Brillman. I'm the executive director of Watish Audubon Society. I'll give you a little bit of background. There are a few new people maybe on tonight. Watish is an independent chapter of the National Audubon with a geographical area stretching through 17 counties in southeast Nebraska. The organization mission includes bringing people together to learn about protect tallgrass prairies as important habitats for birds and other wildlife, promote birding, and advocate for the natural community that includes human beings. You can track what's happening through Watiska's website and Facebook pages and learn how to join in activities and events like were mentioned earlier. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Brian Teeter. Brian is the prescribed fire coordinator for Pheasants Forever, and I've known Brian for a few years and the important work that he does for Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever. Brian grew up in Iowa and has been in Nebraska since 2010. From 2010 to 2015, he was a farm bill biologist in the east central part of the state before transitioning into his current role. Brian works statewide on prescribed fire education, outreach, legislation, and putting fire on the ground on both private and public lands. Brian enjoys hunting and fishing and working on his property, and recently he added a chocolate lab puppy to the family. So I'm sure Brian's been plenty busy, has got some training ahead of him. So with that, the topic of tonight's presentation is A Future with Fire, a cultural change in our relationship with prescribed fire in Nebraska. With that, Brian, take it away.
Thanks, Mark, for having me. Let me see if I can get my screen shared. All right, how's that look?
That's good.
Perfect. All right, thanks for having me tonight. I get real excited when I get to talk about fire. So my presentation is probably longer than it really needs to be, but hopefully it's some good information and you guys learn a little something tonight. So hang on a second here. There we go. All right, so I just want to start off with some background information, right? Let's talk about the history of fire, not only in North America, but even worldwide. But we can shrink it back down to the Great Plains and our tall grass, mixed grass, and even short grass prairies. There's a large history of fire. Fire really has shaped the entire Great Plains to kind of what it is today or what it historically was. And the areas usually burned, on average every 1 to 10 years on average. Some areas could have burned every year, some maybe even longer than the 10-year time frame. But you can see this from this kind of vegetation map. They talks about, kind of the fire return interval historically to maintain those grasslands. And these were fires were caused by basically 3 main drivers, lightning strikes, the Native Americans and early settlers. And today, we've added some things to that as well. But with lightning fires, historically, these would go completely unchecked. These would be dry lightning strikes that basically had ample opportunity to strike all across the Front Range of the Rockies and into Nebraska. Here a couple of years ago, we saw a dry lightning strike actually start a CRP on fire on the eastern part of the state, which is pretty rare because we've lost so much habitat that it usually hits corn and there's no residual material in there to light. But 2/3 of those lightning fires happen in that July and August timeframe. And really these burns, historically, prior to colonization, these things could have gone on for really big fires. If there was a long-term mega drought in the Great Plains, it could burn millions and millions of acres. They could have ran into previous burns, or sometimes, a lot of times now you see that rain actually kind of put them out almost instantly. But then there's a lot of anthropogenic fire, right? The indigenous peoples of the Great Plains, North America and the world, these people lived on the land and with the land. And so they were very adept with fire. And so they had to learn with it. And so learning to live with fire, basically they learned to use fire to their advantage as well. And some of the early colonists that came across were using fire as well when they arrived, because they saw it on the Great Plains, that the Native Americans were using it. So they also used it. But we kind of got into this part where we got into this history of suppression, this mentality of that we need to shut down fire, right? As more and more people entered the Western settlements and started propping up villages and things like that, fires became a liability. And of course, obviously, fires can be very destructive, right? We still see that fires are very destructive with loss of life and property. So, from a certain time period, in the early 1900s, when the Industrial Revolution happened, we started putting a lot of energy and effort into suppression and equipment, and the advent of the war, World War II, World War I. We're starting to spend, money on airplanes and bigger crews to basically suppress these fires, where historically we'd let these fires burn. And now we're at the point where we're spending billions of dollars a year trying to fight these fires. And really, we have not, like three of the five biggest fires this country's ever seen have happened like in the last decade. So we're not doing a great job of it, suppressing these fires. And of course, there's a lot of reasons why our fires are more or worse than they were in the past. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then with the history of suppression, when we talk about prescribed fire, there's a lot of laws and regulations that are out there that are preventing fire from happening on the ground, right? So they're saying, no, we can't have fire happening on the ground because it's going to create wildfires. And we just haven't seen that data that prescribed fires are responsible. And in fact, it's quite the opposite. Power poles, equipment malfunctions in the field, lightning strikes, things of that nature are one of our biggest causes. And being on the volunteer fire department, one of the biggest causes of wildfires are burn barrels. People go out and do a burn barrel, leave it, wind comes up the next day and it gets out. Probably the number one call that we get. So back in the early 1900s, the USDA, Forest Service really wanted to stop these fires because they were really large. And so they started putting out this propaganda, basically saying, fires are bad. We need to stop all these fires. They got Walt Disney involved, and they basically said, fire, we don't want fire. You're going to ruin all the habitat for wildlife in these forests. Well, obviously, we know better now, but there's a pretty extensive campaign. They brought out Smokey the Bear. They brought all these things to essentially try to get people to be more careful of fire, which in itself is not necessarily a bad thing, right? We don't want people irresponsibly starting fires, but the consequences that we had from that are pretty massive, and we'll talk more about that. But so they have these, it wasn't just forests either. Some of these campaigns were also focused on these grassland areas of the Great Plains, where you talk about grass makes meat, prevent your range fires. It's a greater danger than ever. Grass is life, protect it, prevent range fires. Even protect the wealth of the West, prevent range fires. So they had all these propaganda, all this stuff that was put out there, basically saying fire is bad. So we went from a culture pre-colonization of fire is something that they live with and use. Now we're shifting to a culture of suppression. Fire is bad. And they even during World War II, they even got the Nazis involved, basically saying that fires, are just as bad as the Nazis. And of course, during that time frame, obviously that would scare a lot of people. But here in the Great Plains, in particular, one of the things that we've seen as a result of that are the consequences. And the consequences of that, what we're currently facing, are trees, in particular eastern red cedar trees that are invading the Great Plains grasslands. So this is a pretty common sight throughout the Great Plains that you may see in our grasslands. A landscape that was formerly pretty much all grasslands now is becoming dominated by woodlands, eastern red cedar trees. And we've seen this with data from like birds, right? There's a 60% decline in grassland birds. And then if you look at the graph of like woodland birds, that graph is kind of going the other direction because these woodlands are starting to advance in our grassland systems. When people always talk about, you know, this eastern red cedar is a native tree, and it was, and it is. However, it was pretty rare on the Great Plains, and we know this by, you know, historical accounts, but also when settlers and people came across, they weren't building log cabins, right? They were building sod houses. So trees were historically rare on our Great Plains, and we see this transition of these trees invading these plains to this current day. Many people have seen areas across the state. Everybody's got like a farmstead or know a place. It's called Lone Cedar Tree Hill or Lone Cedar Hill. Well, here's a good example of this. This is at Camp Moses Merrill by Linwood and Morse Bluff up here. This place is called Lone Cedar Hill, but obviously you can see that the cedar has got some friends now. And so it is no longer Lone Cedar Hill. However, we went in and did remove almost all the cedar trees, and we did leave one cedar tree on top of that hill. It was a male up there. So the rest of those trees are all bur oak, hickory woodlands that are surrounding there, which are also fire adapted. But you can also see this cultural shift in our just, you know, everyday lexicon, right? We've got this area, it's called Covenant Cedars. And ironically or unironically, right below it is right next to Prairie Island. So you've got these two competing ideas of like, okay, here's a covenant of cedars, right? That's looked at like a very good thing. But then right next to it, you've got this Prairie Island, which ironically the cedars are taking over the prairie. I travel a lot, so you got down in McCook, there's a place called Cedar Inn. So you can see that cedars are starting to become like more accepted on the landscape. There's another Baptist camp that's called Whispering Cedars. That's on the way to like Genoa, just west of Genoa there. We have named rivers after cedar trees. Campgrounds named after cedar trees. And I don't know if you've ever tried to take a nap underneath of a shady cedar tree, but it's not the best tree to crawl up under and get shade from. It smells good, but it's pretty bushy underneath. And of course, we are, you know, the state where Arbor Day was founded. And so we kind of have a long history of planting these trees or trees across the plains. So we've kind of created this culture of, right, no fire and trees. But the consequences of that we've seen have led to dramatic declines in our wildlife, increased wildfire behavior for when wildfires do happen, all these things that kind of follow these dominoes. So with the increase of cedar trees on the landscape, we actually started a different type of culture moving in now. Now we started this culture of, okay, we need to get rid of these cedar trees. And so since fire is still a 4-letter word and bad, what we saw are a lot of these cedar tree or tree contractors coming in and trying to manage these trees on the landscape. And basically what happens is that they go out and they'll cut these trees, you know, in their grasslands, and they'll cause a disturbance, especially in these larger cedar trees. And that disturbance basically creates a perfect seed bed for the next generation of trees. So you end up with a scenario that looks like this, right? So in the next couple of years, what you end up with are new seedlings. And a lot of times what happens is that going unchecked, they end up turning into more of a carpet of cedar trees and actually have a worse problem than you did before. Instead of a bunch of large trees out there that are really big, now you got, you know, hundreds of trees within a 10 square foot area, making it more of like a carpet of little trees. So basically what we've done, you know, mechanical has its place on the landscape, but without that follow of fire, we're really kind of just chasing our tail. And there's, of course, a bunch of other reasons why we're using fire, right? Just killing cedar trees is not necessarily our, number one thing, right? We have ranchers that are using it to improve our forage for livestock. Of course, we're using it for wildlife habitat, pheasants and quail, songbirds, all that stuff. We're using it to maintain, help maintain our plant diversity, reducing wildfire risk. If you have areas, wildfire get into areas with cedar trees, it's nearly impossible to extinguish without the help of these really expensive airplanes. And so it's a lot easier to put out grass fires. And of course, big one with cedar trees is we're managing succession, right? We're trying to prevent our beloved prairies and grasslands from going into these type of forests that we don't want, right? We still want our oak forests and our cottonwoods and some of those forests, but we don't want cedar forests. And they also help us manage invasive species. So basically, the question that we have to ask ourselves now and 20 years ago is really, what type of world do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a world where we're constantly fighting this battle to clear cedar trees, to make sure that the cycle that we go through, cut the cedar trees, wait another 15 years, clear them again, extinguish wildfires that are uncontrollable? Or do we want to really live in a world where we're using fire as was intended, right? Cool maintenance type fires on a landscape that are managing our succession, managing our grasslands, managing for our wildlife, preventing that succession on the landscape. And obviously, I'm a fire guy, wildlife biologist by training, and the type of world I want to live in is one with fire. So fire is making a comeback, right? So a couple of years ago, I heard the story of, and it was roughly in about the 70s or so. There's a gentleman that came up here from the southeastern United States and was talking about the need for fire, in Nebraska. Basically, they asked the question, "Why aren't you burning up here?" And in that 70s time frame, some people, mostly I think is in the game parks, they basically started burning. And there are other landowners, of course, that were burning, Flint Hills burning, stuff like that. But and since then, right, since a long time before, fire has been proven both through the science and the application to be a good thing for our landscape and a needed thing. And so, currently right now, fire is being used on private lands, and of course, almost every state, federal, and nonprofit conservation organization, including Watish Audubon Society, has been using fire to manage their grasslands and their woodlands and wetlands and everything else. So the thing that we want to think about is how do we normalize this process? How do we change? How do we go from a culture of fear of fire, of not using fire, to a culture of using fire and a culture of acceptance of fire? Not only through the practitioners, but to the larger general and public in general, right? The people in Omaha and Lincoln that maybe don't get out of their house and don't explore places that need fire. So there's this theory, it's called the normalization process theory. It's basically what it means is what are the things that people are doing to create the culture to change that process, right? So the things that individuals and groups do to operationalize new and modified modes of practice as they interact with their elements in their environment. It basically defines the process of implementation, the embedding, the integration as it occurs, to deliberately initiate and seek to sustain the sequence of events bringing into operation. So it's basically all these things, right? It's a strategic thing that people try to accomplish to create this process and to create basically an essential cultural process, cultural change. So we had to basically have to engage in like these new activities, right? New ways of thinking, acting, organizing, to become embedded in the existing knowledge of practice. And I think one of the earliest, I think it was somewhere in the early 80s, was one of the first places that we saw mention of prescribed fire in the Nebraska NRCS realm. I can't remember what the exact year, but it was right around that early 80s time frame that it kind of became thought about a practice. So basically, we want fire to be, ingrained into the public's mind as something that's considered positive and useful. But this is obviously something that's not going to happen overnight, right? If it was, it'd be great if I could, snap my fingers tonight and everybody would be accepting a fire and everybody would be using fire, on their grasslands and woodlands and wetlands tomorrow. I would do it. So I always say that, basically culture is curated, it's not created, right? I can't just like create culture. We have to like curate it and allow it to develop and become a process for those people that need to be using it. So how do we disrupt our current culture or the past culture of fear of fire, right? So we kind of go through this list of these different things, right? We're going to provide education, provide training, provide equipment, establish prescribed burn associations, private land burn associations. We take a look at laws and regulations. So I'll talk about a little bit about some of the things that we do within Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever, Nebraska, along with some of our partners. There's a lot of different things happening on the landscape, and more is happening as we, continue to go on this journey of getting more fire on the landscape. But to me, educating the public on the uses and benefits of fire is a high priority. I spend a lot of my time giving presentations and that to the public, putting on workshops, things of that nature. One of the things that we've been doing since about 2008, are holding these prescribed fire workshops. We do a little bit of a couple different things. We do like a basic workshop that kind of covers the basics of planning, preparing, and conducting the burn. And then we kind of do more advanced workshops where we dive into very specific things about fire or fire adapted systems, grasslands, woodlands, things of that nature. We also do habitat tours. These habitat tours, so basically showing the results of fire, or looking at our fire adapted landscapes and telling them why we need fire on the landscape. We put a lot of people that come to these tours, close to 160 or 4,000 people have attended those. We've had about 171 burn workshops with almost 4,300 participants. That's not including this year. We got another about 200 so far this year. And we just had our last basic one recently, just the other day, Tuesday. And then we still have some advanced workshops that are coming up here in the future. So some other things, not only myself as for Quail Forever, but there's a lot of different things in the landscape now that are happening, right? So I don't know if in the last 10 years, I think it's gotten a lot more traction, but you see a lot of magazine, newspaper articles, a lot of social media. Every time you turn around, you see more and more talk about prescribed fire. And that is done by strategic design, right? One, we're people that are in positions like myself and game parks, we're putting that information out there specifically to educate people on these matters. But then there's also a lot of curious reporters out there too that look at why are we having more wildfires? Why are they more deadly? Why are these cedar trees popping up? I've taken around several journalists in the last year or two across the state burning and stuff like that, showing them our problem and what we're trying to do about it. And you'll see articles in National Geographic, New York Times. So there's a lot of different stuff out there. And then of course there's just a ton of scientific research. We're blessed to have Direct Twidwell and his lab, or Oklahoma State, John Weir down in Oklahoma, the folks in Kansas doing a lot of great research on fire and the fire adapted systems to basically back up to say, yes, fire is part of our system and we need more of it. If you've listened to Direct talk, he basically does it better than anybody about sounding the alarm bells about the transition of our grasslands to woody plant encroachment. And it's a real big issue, but we're gaining traction on all these fronts. The other thing we're really trying to do is we're trying to empower 98% of the state of Nebraska and really the Great Plains privately owned. And so in order for us to accomplish our objectives on the landscape of maintaining our grasslands and prairie, we have to empower these landowners and land managers, and teaching them about the art and skill of using prescribed fire. It's not something that you could just like wake up one morning and go out and do. You got to go out and do a little bit of your due diligence and learn some basic terminology and skills to create that fire culture within these areas. So every year we have members of our burn associations take on basically new members of the community and pass along their knowledge. So taking their knowledge and passing it on to the next generation. I think in the last 6 years or so I've been in my position, you're starting to see that transition. These older landowners that are starting to gain these fire knowledges are bringing in the younger generation, and this younger generation is really hyped up about maintaining these grasslands and getting rid of trees, and conserving these fire adapted systems, which is great. And we have every year we have not only members from the PBAs, but we have staff from like many state, federal, nonprofits that are out there helping train these landowners as well, which it takes everybody. So we also do some live fire training, and basically every prescribed burn association that we have, every burn is a live fire training. Every event is a training event. And a couple years ago, we started doing more growing season burns. So typically, our time frame or window that we're using prescribed burns is in like April. And there's just more and more research out there that's just showing that April is just, not always the greatest time frame to be burning for many, many reasons. It's a whole different webinar. But we're starting to move our burn window to like 365 days a year. So considering every day is a burn day to make it happen. One of the best things that we do is when we get local volunteer fire departments to come out and help, right? So obviously local volunteer fire departments are going to be the ones that are going to respond to wildfires. So bringing them into the process of lighting prescribed fire is a huge benefit. I know on our volunteer fire department, we did a couple burns with them, and there's just no other substitute to get that kind of experience on a fire under controlled situation. Because when a wildfire breaks out, you just, don't have time to be thinking about, some of these things. And so learning under a controlled environment about fire behavior and things of that nature is an invaluable training tool for these fire departments. The other thing that we've been doing, and we need to do more of, is providing equipment, because a lot of this equipment that we use for prescribed fire is a little bit specialized, and it can be very cost prohibitive. And then also we provide that education on how to use that. There are workshops and demonstrations and videos and stuff that we do. The Nebraska Environmental Trust has really helped us out in this situation, help them find equipment, get out there, just invaluable. Some of the stuff, drip torches, UTVs, pumpers, clothing, radios, some of those key ingredients that we need on the landscape that, a normal landowner just maybe can't go out and buy a $7,000 pumper to burn. So providing that equipment. And then once we provide this equipment to these landowners, we put it in basically this nice package of a trailer, and we give these to landowner groups like PBAs. And what these PBAs do, this is basically like a starter kit. And what happens is that these PBAs take this trailer and use it on their prescribed burns, but then they also acquire their own burn equipment. So on top of this trailer, a couple guys may create their own skid units. They may need to buy more radios or more drip torches. So we're basically giving them the foundation of doing a prescribed burn and allowing them kind of to get them started, right? To get them in the right direction, get their foot off the ground. And then the goal is to kind of let them take it from there and move on with it. As you can see, we custom built these trailers, carrying drip torches, clothing, stuff like that. We currently have about 15 of these burn units going across the state. Several other organizations, Game and Parks has a few, TNC's got some, a few other organizations kind of put these together. But we got all this equipment running across the state that's being used on a yearly basis to get more and more fire on the ground. And we're not where we need to be, but we're working that way, right? We're changing that culture and changing that cultural shift to pro fire. So here's just a list of kind of our more formal prescribed burn associations. And these prescribed burn associations are just landowner-based groups that get together and help each other burn. We've got about 11 of these going across the state now. We just formed a new one back in December 2021, Southwest Custer County in the Callaway area. We got a new one. We just had a meeting a couple weeks ago. It's going to be in Knox County. We've done about 1,000 burns since about 2008 and put in about 45,000 hours worth of work on getting these fires on the ground. But most importantly, what we're doing is that, we're helping build, remember that process theory about integrating fire into the culture, right? The more smoke plumes that you see on the landscape, the more that is creating a culture. One of the things I talk about all the time is we did a burn at Helmuth Marsh and just north of Lincoln there. And it was, I can't remember, it was a northeast wind or west wind, but we were basically kind of pushing smoke to the northwest corner of Lincoln. And I remember there was a lady got out of her car. She opened up the trunk and she pulls out this long lens. I'm talking like a $15,000, birder's dream telephoto lens. And she's aiming it right at us and snapping a few pictures and just jotting down a couple notes in her book. And I was like, oh, I hope she comes over here and talks to us. Well, nope. She packed up that camera back in the trunk, got in, turned around and left. And I was just kind of waiting for that next day to be, oh no, we're going to get this bad press. Well, the next day on the front page of the Lincoln Journal-Star, it says that time of year. And then under the headline with the picture that was on there, it said prescribed burns are used for such and such and such. And it was like front page. And that's about a good indicator that our culture and society is changing to accept fire more often, is when fire happens. It's like, oh, yep, it's that time of year. We're doing it again this year. So we're helping build that fire culture and ingrain it into our communities. It's one of those things that just have this huge impact, and all these things just kind of combine to make that effort. And of course, it's not just prescribed burn associations or agencies doing this. There's a lot of fires that happen on the landscape that we have no. A family goes out and they burn their prairie off every year, every couple of years. And we have this really cool satellite technology that picks up these fires every year. And we can kind of see where fires are happening across the state and even across the country that happen. Now, typically we can't differentiate between a wildfire and a prescribed fire, but this is basically the month of April. You can see that this is prime time for burning. You can see there's this clustering of fires across the state. And you see more happening down the southeast. So some of the other things that we do to change that culture is we're trying to change some of the laws that are currently out in the books to be more prescribed fire friendly, right? We're trying to make sure that they're not a hindrance or burdensome. So in 2015, there was a Nebraska Prescribed Fire Council that was formed. And this was basically a landowner-led organization promoting prescribed fire across the state. And the entire board consists of landowners that are actively using fire and promoting fire. And then the advisory board, which I'm a part of, basically consists of, state and local nonprofit organizations that are there to assist the landowners in trying to, promote fire and assist with laws and regulations and stuff like that. If anybody's interested, we do hold an annual conference every year in Kearney. This year, we haven't had one for 2 years because of COVID. But this year, we're going to be doing the Great Plains Fire Summit, which is going to be in North Platte in September 27th through the 29th, I believe it is this year. So one of the things I was going to talk about, you may have seen on your newsletter, there was LB 953, which is a change in the state statute surrounding controlled burning. And that was basically put forth to help change those laws to make it easier for landowners to use fire. And basically it provides gross negligence. So, if something happens on a fire, they have to prove gross negligence to be held liable. And the reason why that change, we're trying to get that change passed, is because those that are using prescribed fire on the landscape currently, they're not only doing it for themselves, right? It's not just a them thing. People that are out there doing prescribed burns, removing cedar trees, maintaining our grasslands, they're doing it as a public benefit. We have every conservation organization I know of pretty much is providing money or technical assistance to remove cedar trees. But the landowners are providing, or not only they're doing the burning, but they're also they're taking the brunt of the liability. So what we're saying is that in order for this process to become more implemented, we need to make sure that fire is a public benefit and is a shared liability for everybody across the state. And that's why some of that change is trying to be pushed through. Now we'll see what happens, but if you want to talk to your senator about supporting it, it'd be a good one to support. So all this cultural change, where does it lead us, right? So we're still like in this transitional cultural phase, but in the future, and we're getting there fast, exponentially faster now, to a point where people realize that prescribed fire is something that's needed on the landscape. So in the future, I look at what do these propaganda in the future look like, right? The propaganda that we need to be creating now. So you remember back this one, grass makes meat, and we're going to cross out prevent. So grass makes meat, range fires. Cedars are a greater danger than ever. About grass's life, protect it, range fires. Protect the wealth of the Great Plains, range fires. And then this is kind of the big one, right? Remember this poster here trying to get recruiting people? We can change this to, I want you to be an advocate for prescribed fire to help normalize its rightful place in Nebraska and the Great Plains. Because ultimately, it's not just up to me or game and parks people or conservation staff. Everybody needs to be advocating for prescribed fire and talking about it, especially those people who don't understand it or think negatively about it. Because typically when they hear about fire, it's the negative stuff. It's about a wildfire that happened. But they don't look at the other 99.99% of prescribed fires that are safe and successful in doing public beneficial work on the landscape. So some of you may not get this reference, but Homer Simpson of The Simpsons really puts it kind of a final touch on it.
You're doing that stuck away. Try a little vitamin G. Relax, it's a control burn.
So it's kind of funny, but Homer Simpson is a no nonsense guy, and and realizes that the best way to do something many times is with the use of fire. So again, creating that cultural change, that cultural shift, I think we're well on our way, and it can't come fast enough. So I'll take questions if anybody has any.
Brian,
Yes.
this is Arliss. Somebody has a question in the chat room that says, why is there so much pushback to year-round burning when Lincoln asks the Flint Hills farmers and ranchers to quit lowering our air quality during the month of April?
Yeah. So again, this basically ties right back into culture, right? So the reason why they burn every year in that 2 weeks of April is because there was a study done saying that they can gain, an extra 30, 40 pounds per animal on a late spring burn. And so they have this long history and basically created a culture that we're going to burn every time this year. So just like we're trying to change the culture of getting fire on a landscape, they're trying to change their culture to creating or doing burns during different times of the season. And just like us, it's something that's not going to happen overnight. So unfortunately, it's something that we're just going to have to kind of deal with. And it's not saying I'm not sympathetic, and I am very sympathetic to people that have health problems and those smoke problems that are created for sure. But we have to look at the long-term picture of it too. Is we also really like beef, and beef is produced from that burning. But certainly there's changes that could be implemented in the Flint Hills that would be beneficial for both wildlife and people's health that I think they're working on. They're not, what do I want to say? They're not immune to the criticism. They understand it, and I think they're working on it. So hopefully in the future we can all live a little bit better with them burning differently too.
Brian, could you elaborate upon that a little bit upon that legislation that is pending in the before the unicameral? What the purpose of it is?
Yep. So basically, yeah. So right now, Nebraska doesn't have any defined negligence when it comes to prescribed fire control burning laws, and so basically, it's kind of just up to the court system to kind of figure it out. So gross negligence basically is going to define the legal process. So basically what they're saying is that right now, if you do a prescribed burn and something gets away on you, you're basically going to be held liable for the damages. Under a gross fire negligence, what that means is that in order to be held liable for those damages, you're going to have to be found willfully misconductful or grossly negligent. To be so basically, if something gets out and burns down a fence or something like that, basically it'd be up to the person that's suing to provide you were grossly negligent. And the reason why they're doing that is because, again, it's a public benefit. Now, one of the ranchers that testified made a really great point is that, in our country, if a fire gets out, we burn down somebody's fence, we replace it, no matter what the law says, no matter what the statute says. And the other thing about this law too is we look at it is the success rate of a prescribed burn throughout the Great Plains is 99.2%. That 0.8% that escapes and gets away, those escapes are typically less than 40 acres in size. And there's been no major insurance claim from a prescribed fire where they were followed their burn plan. So, if you go out and light a fire without a burn plan or you don't have the right equipment, basically this statute wouldn't apply to you because you'd be found grossly negligent because you weren't doing a properly planned or permitted burn. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Brian.
I think I understand it. The other thing about it is, you think about that what gets the notoriety are the big fires that get away, like the one out there in western Kansas.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what gets people's attention, and it doesn't. I don't know how how do you counter that?
Well, you got to think about too. Most of these big wildfires are at like the one that are you talking about, the one that just happened here recently,
Yeah.
December
Yeah.
one. So, do you know what caused that fire?
No, I don't.
It was power pole, power
Okay.
lines that blow. It was 80-mile-an-hour wind gusts and power lines. Power lines are like one of the number one causes of large wildfires in the Great Plains. But do you see anybody talking about burying infrastructure?
No, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, nobody talks about that, right? We have all this above ground utility power poles, and not once do you ever hear anybody talking about burying that infrastructure to prevent wildfires. So, instead, people take that assumption. They're like, oh, we need to stop all fire, right? So it's that old mentality that people are working with, that all fire is bad. When reality is that there are things that are causing fire that we need to fix. And one of those things that aren't causing these large wildfires are prescribed fires.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. There's been instances of prescribed fires getting out. There's one in Texas, that Bastrop fire just a couple weeks ago. So don't get me wrong. There are some fires get away, but 99% of these fires that make the news for being really bad are from things that we can fix, but are just unwilling to, I think, because they cost money.
Just like most COVID is now among unvaccinated individuals, most of these fires that escape, if you round up the farmers and ranchers who were engaged in that prescribed burn that escaped, never had a lick of training.
Yeah.
They just got called by their buddy to show up some Saturday with a drip torch and go at it.
Yep, you're absolutely right. That happens all the time, and they typically don't have the right equipment with them either. They're or the proper fire breaks. So yeah, there's all these things that go into it. And that's part of that cultural shift of making sure people have access to training and the equipment that they need. But yeah, I mean, I could think of a couple. The big one here in Nebraska. They were out there. They had a cooler beer with them, and there's a wind shift that happened in the middle of it. All that stuff was just bad all around. And under this new state statute, they would have been found grossly negligent. Anyway.
So and this is
How
Teresa.
is that how is gross negligence defined?
Oh boy, there is. If you really like, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to.
I am, and I can tell you.
Okay, perfect.
Marking on.
You're engaging in activity with which you have no experience, training, or expertise.
Okay.
Perfect. Yeah, if you are interested in this subject, I believe on February 16th, Carissa Wonka, who is a former member of Dr. Direct Whitwell's lab, she'll be doing a webinar on prescribed fire legislation and stuff across the country too. So I can send that to whoever, if they want to send that out to the group, they can.
Hey, Brian, question of mine is, I've been looking into some of the prescribed burning. The photo in my background is actually my north pasture, and we have quite a few cedars. My goal is to cut 10 down a day, and try to get caught up with them a little bit, but the young ones still growing. So I've been looking into prescribed burn and the Tri-County burners. So who would be the first phone call for me to start the planning process?
So I would get ahead, if you've already worked with, cutting trees. Ed Hubbs is the president of that. He's with Spring Creek Audubon there.
Okay.
Him, and then I would also get a hold of John McClinton, which is our biologist there in Lancaster, Lincoln. He covers the surrounding counties. Both of them would be able to help kind of guide you through on, if you need a cost share assistance or putting together a prescribed burn plan. Ed's got, the equipment and kind of the inner workings of that PPA there. Those two people are the two people that I would first contact.
Okay, thank you. The follow-up question that was on you had mentioned it'd be a separate webinar, but time of the year. I was reading up on Oklahoma State University's extension program, I guess, for lack of the exact title.
Sure.
And they were talking about summer burns, when everything was green. Once it gets hot, it burns. And the benefits of that, with that kind of what I was thinking of our pastures is mostly warm season natives, big blue and big Indian and some side oats and a little bit of little blue. But we also have quite a few wildflowers in it too. And I want to maximize the wildflowers at the same time. So looking into what is the best time for, those goals?
Yeah, and a lot of times it's going to be kind of site dependent and your goals. So a lot of times, it's something that we would come out and take a look at, the condition of your pasture, your goals and all that stuff and look at it. But, many times, burning at any time of the year typically is not going to have huge transformational impacts on grasslands. Grasslands are really resilient. So you can really burn pretty much any time of year. There's been several studies that come out, last few years, and one that just came out here last week, basically showing that, for plant diversity and some of the other things, that late spring time frame in which we're burning, that late April, is actually one of the worst times to burn. Because those early forbs and wildflower growth is initiating, and then become basically kind of come over the top of it, and then they struggle to kind of come back up. So when you're looking at doing like a summer burn or a fall burn, they have that time period of recovery and early growth that those wildflowers need. So yeah, it's really site dependent. I like doing summer burns because they're just so much safer, especially if you're in an area, in a landscape where you have houses and stuff like that. It's a lot safer to do because it burns differently. The only bad thing associated with it is it does create a little more smoke, which is the bad thing, because you can't control typically where your smoke goes unless you pick the right one direction. So
keep the mosquitoes away for a night.
Yeah. Good news, we're not burning 2.5 million acres in 2 weeks in the summer.
Yeah.
So.
Brian?
Yeah.
This is Arliss again. There's a question in the chat room right after Don asked about the Kansas burns. Someone says, how do you counter folks who dislike the smoke from Kansas?
Yeah. Boy, that's a great question. Again, it's kind of one of those sensitive topics because, many of the folks that dislike smoke from Kansas, some of them have serious health issues associated with that. So I think the outreach that we'd have to do, for that has to be pretty sensitive. There was a meeting. Every year they do a meeting in the Lincoln, Lancaster, Douglas County, the health departments across the Great Plains get together and talk. And, one of the suggestions that was made is that, maybe we provide N95 masks. Well, COVID kind of, came and now everybody's got N95 masks, but, maybe providing HEPA filters for people that are smoke sensitive for that time frame as well. So, you can counteract it by saying, listen, like they're doing this and they're doing this for a reason, right? Not only are we raising beef, but we have all these, pollinators and wildlife and grasslands that we're maintaining with this fire. We realize that there's a trade-off with your health, but that trade-off, here are some solutions for you to mitigate that. And I get it, like I don't like when Kansas smoked me out either. Like I'm a big proponent of fire, but I don't like it, but I bear it, because one thing that I've seen, the biggest thing that I've seen is in this day and age of this culture of 10-second news bites and stuff like that, is when the Kansas smoke comes into the state of Nebraska, the media will blast it all over the news for one day. And as soon as that smoke clears, boy, you don't hear a single thing about it. And so like it comes in and leaves just as fast. And so a lot of it is, I think, media related too. I think the media strategy would be like, listen, this sucks, but here's all the benefits that we get out of it. But it's also another thing to be able, like in my position, to reach out to those news people and tell them how to do their job. Because a lot of times their job is clicks, unfortunately.
Brian, how do various burn times, summer, fall, winter, spring, affect wildlife like birds, butterflies, etc.?
Sure, I think so. That's a little bit of another really difficult question to answer. But again, most plants and animals are resilient to fire and burning in general, and they're also resilient to different times of year. Because if you think about it, historically, fire, they were raised with fire, right? Their habitats were born from fire. And so they've adapted from January burns, like, this time of year, summer burns, all times of the year, you're going to have different effects. Now it's about scale, really. So I think the question probably is about scale. So if you've got a 30-acre CRP or 30-acre rangeland site and you're surrounded by crop fields for 40 miles, your burn times and the amount you burn is different than, say, if you're burning in the sand hills. So you're looking at scale. With those various burn times, anytime you burn, you're going to have an effect on something, right? So it doesn't matter if you're burning spring, summer, fall, or winter. You're always going to have an impact positively or negatively on something. And it's just a matter of what are those positive and negatives that you're willing to live with or of what you want.
What steps are you considering with increased climate change?
Yeah, so one of the things, a couple of years ago, we had a speaker, National Weather Service. He said that based on the climate models, that Nebraska is due to get warmer and wetter. And I made the joke that we're going to have eastern red cedar rainforests, which is not funny, but it is. But yeah, so definitely looking in, we're seeing the impacts of climate as it is right now. It's been 60 degrees for like 2 weeks in January and February. And I don't know about you guys, but at my place here in Linwood, I've had 4 millimeters of snow precipitation all winter, like zero pretty much. And I just, things are changing. And unfortunately, we can't predict the future. So we don't know if, we could be going into a long-term drought. And if we do that, that could positively benefit us because we can probably kill more cedar trees. Negative, it's going to have an impact on everything else that cascades down there from wildlife and cattle, beef industry, and all that stuff. But yeah, it's something that we need to be considering because wildfires are getting worse because of climate in the Great Plains as well.
Here's a question from the very beginning while you were speaking. It says, I heard it mentioned, but want to make sure everyone knows that the seed-bearing trees can be removed and the other ones with only pollen will not spread.
Yeah. There are a lot of people with allergies that would that would take not kind to that comment, but yeah, they can be. The only problem with that is depending on your landscape, that would work well if you were maybe in a suburban area. But when we're out burning rangeland, larger chunks of ground of cedar trees, there's no discrimination. We can't pick and choose which one we're burning. But if you're, removing stuff from windbreaks or you're in a suburban area to help prevent spread, that's a good approach.
I have a question, Brian.
Yep.
What types of plants do fires control the most? I'm talking about exotic or non-native plants. What are the most easily killed, and which ones are the least easily killed by a fire?
Cedar trees the most, and then everything else is not. And that's why it's such, when we talk a lot about fire and cedar trees, is that it's a really easy, simple solution to get rid of them, right? Add fire. When we talk about brome grass or Cerisa lespedeza, there's all these other steps, or even like deciduous trees like elm trees and cottonwoods. There's all these other steps that we have to take in addition to fire. But with cedar trees, just add fire. I mean, so yeah, that's pretty much. I mean, there's probably others, but cedar's kind of the main culprit there.
I've got a question that's a little off the subject, but I wonder if you might be able to talk on it a little bit. Pheasants Forever is a pretty big organization, and they do lots of different things. Is it possible you could talk about some of the other activities and the mission of the Pheasants Forever group?
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, Pheasants Forever is definitely, it's gotten larger in the last 10, 15 years as well. Our name kind of gets associated with pheasants and quail, and people kind of automatically assume that's all we do. But like I've told other groups, like I don't care about pheasants. Like honestly, I just don't. Like I look at the whole system as a holistic thing. And so, when somebody says, "Oh, you're just in it for the pheasants," not really. I don't really care. But I'm looking at it from an ecosystem level, and I think most of our organization is the same way. Unfortunately, I think we kind of got pigeonholed into saying that we only care about two birds, pheasants and quail. But we're big into pollinators and ecosystem management. We have a lot of education outreach programs. We obviously have a big hunter component to our mission as well. But as we all know, that a lot of that those tax dollars from hunting and hunting associated activities basically loop back and go right back into conservation efforts. And so, we really, as an organization, kind of run the gamut of different things. We've got people in the organization that focus on fire. We've got people in the western states dealing with sage grouse, juniper removal out there. We've got people in the southeast looking at pines. We got people scattered all across this country doing good work out there, for all those things. But yeah, for me personally, it's about managing the ecosystem and maintaining a healthy balance, and specifically prairies. And, grasslands are just my thing. I like my oak woodlands too. Don't get me wrong, my passion is grasslands. So.
Okay, any others in the chat box, Arliss?
No, that's it. Well, just a minute now. I got you. What is the ideal habitat for pheasants?
Oh, I know this one too. Be honest with you, ideal pheasant habitat, find a crop field and just let it go. Weedy, nasty, the nastiest, tallest weeds you can find is going to be the best pheasant habitat. If as a hunter, as myself as a hunter, if I'm going to go hunt a place and the place looks like a giant sunflower field that nobody's planted, it's got foxtail, a bunch of stuff in there, that's where I'm going. Nice, beautiful grasslands, obviously. I mean, pheasants they're a very generalist species. They can kind of thrive in any environment. But if I'm trying to get the most amount of birds produced on an acre, I'm just basically going to let cropland just go to weeds and foxtail for that. And then I guess I'll add to that too. The other ideal pheasant habitat is grasslands without trees.
Without trees.
Yes.
The last
Bigger the better.
The last question is,